Tomodachi Life for the 3DS is a true cult classic. I mean, the game sold over 6.5 million copies, so it's not that overlooked. But among huge experiences like Mario, Zelda, and Splatoon, Tomodachi Life stands in firm opposition as a funny little game that doesn't take itself at all seriously. So where did Tomodachi Life come from? Well, in this video, we'll take a look at the history of Tomodachi Life, as well as its Japan-exclusive prequel, Tomodachi Collection for the DS. We'll take a look at the people who created this weird, wacky, and beloved series, and how the groundwork may have been laid for Tomodachi Life living the dream. This is the history of Tomodachi Life. Our story starts in 2005, 1 year after the launch of the Nintendo DS. Yoshio Sakamoto is one of Nintendo's longest-standing developers, known for his work on a huge range of series, from Metroid to Rhythm Heaven, from Famicom Detective Club to WarioWare. Back on the Game Boy, Sakamoto and his team put out a game called Hamtaro: The Great Friendship Plan, where players would input information about their friends, and then the game would tell their daily fortunes. But the game didn't sell very well, since only people who knew and loved the Hamtaro manga series were interested in buying the game. However, one of the female developers working on the project told Sakamoto, "We'd like some software like this that adult women can enjoy too." Sakamoto made a mental note of that, and by 2005, he decided to take on this idea wholeheartedly. The DS had recently launched, and the company was keen to expand its audience among women. And so, Sakamoto's team began developing a game called Otona no Onna no Uranai Techo, which means fortune-telling notebook for adult women. Indeed, that's a pretty direct way to target the female demographic. So, the idea for the game was to input information about friends and family into this virtual notebook, and then the game would be able to tell the fortunes of those around you. It was a direct evolution of the Hamtaro game, but targeting an older demographic. But when one of the developers suggested adding some kind of virtual avatar to the game, little did they know what a huge rabbit hole they'd be going down. Enter the Miis. Sakamoto's team based their avatars on a Japanese children's game called Fukuwarai, which is kind of like Pin the Tail on the Donkey, except instead of a donkey and a tail, it's a face along with the various facial features that belong there. In fact, Super Mario Odyssey features a set of mini-games based directly on Fukuwarai, so you've probably experienced for yourself how just repositioning a small collection of facial features can totally transform how the finished face looks. So, the team put together a simple prototype of resizing and rotating a small set of facial features, and they quickly realized that almost anyone's face could be represented with startling accuracy. Sakamoto showed the team's prototype to Satoru Iwata, who showed it to Shigeru Miyamoto, who decided to implement these avatars not just in a single game, but throughout the Wii console. That is how the Miis were born, and while it was a great thing for Nintendo and players alike, it didn't spell good news for fortune-telling notebook for adult women, since all of that game's developers were now totally busy bringing Miis to life on the Nintendo Wii. But a year later, Sakamoto's developers were returned to him, and the team was once again ready to work on their fortune-telling notebook game. But while the initial plan had been to target adult women, in the time the project was on hold, the DS had already become a great hit with this target audience. and so the scope was widened to target all demographics. According to director Ryutaro Takahashi, the team would create the ultimate family software that just makes you want to get up and show it to people. And so, the team renamed their game from Fortune-Telling Notebook for Adult Women to Tomodachi Collection. The game would still be a kind of notebook in a sense, where players could enter information about their family, co-workers, and friends. A virtual collection of all your friends, or in Japanese, your Tomodachi, hence Tomodachi Collection. Now, rather than just cataloguing data, birthdays, heights, weights, and so on, the team wanted something more playful. Producer Yoshio Sakamoto had recently gone on a management course where the leader talked about categorizing all employees into 4 categories. But rather than use this information in his role as manager, the concept was used in Tomodachi Collection to input and categorize your friends' personalities. So that was the core of the game decided on, but how did it become so weird? Well, that's almost entirely thanks to one team member, programmer Masanori Nakagawa. During the day, Nakagawa programmed what was asked of him, but outside working hours, he'd add, well, whatever he wanted into the game. Like, Nakagawa decided one day to make the Miis sing, Vocaloid style. Very impressive, but hard to know how to use within the game. And while director Ryutaro Takahashi tried to figure out the answer to where to put these singing Miis, programmer Nakagawa had already moved on to his next project. He had the idea of showing the Miis riding a roller coaster, so he programmed a system to display Mii heads on top of pre-made background images. And this one feature ended up being used throughout Tomodachi Collection. And to make the Miis scream while riding the roller coaster, Nakagawa fiddled with his singing code so that the Miis would also be able to talk. That's right, the Miis were actually singing long before they were talking. So, a kind of weird partnership fell into place, where programmer Masanori Nakagawa would program weird little features that no one asked for, and director Ryutaro Takahashi would have to figure out where best to use these features in the finished game. It really was Masanori Nakagawa who we have to thank for Tomodachi Collection, and later Tomodachi Life's offbeat vibe. Take the music, for instance. By the time composer Daisuke Shiba started working on Tomodachi Collection's soundtrack, the Miis were already speaking out loud in weird robotic voices. So Daisuke Shiba tried writing music that wouldn't draw too much focus away from the talking Miis. But even so, producer Yoshio Sakamoto said, "It's too beautiful and you put in too much effort." In the end, following Sakamoto's direction, Daisuke Shiba wrote a number of songs completely freely, and the final result was music which sounded cheap and throwaway, but intentionally so. Shiba ended up leaving the project halfway through, and his replacement, composer Asuka Ito, continued writing music which sounded, well, cheap. She said at the time, "I've been put in charge of making some truly out-there music." And so, on the 18th of June 2009, Tomodachi Collection was released in Japan. But what about localization? Well, Nintendo of America stated that there were some plans to bring the game over to the rest of the world, but the team couldn't get the voice synthesis to work for other languages. You see, in Japanese, each character is always pronounced the same way. Ka is always ka, ta is always ta, and so on. But in English, that's not the case. The letter A alone, for instance, can be pronounced A, R, even ear. Because of this, making speech synthesis for English is a lot harder. However, back in Japan, the game was hugely successful, far more so than anyone at Nintendo had expected. In its first week, it sold over 100,000 copies, and by the end of the year, it had sold over 1 million. All in all, Tomodachi Collection reached sales of 3.76 million, hugely impressive for a Japan-only DS game. And that's the story of how the Tomodachi Life series got its start. But what about the games that followed? Well, after the release of Tomodachi Collection, the development team was disbanded to work on a variety of 3DS system software. But during that time, director Ryutaro Takahashi would often talk with producer Yoshio Sakamoto about ideas for a sequel. And a year or so later, that chance would come around when the core development team of Tomodachi Collection was done with their 3DS software. It was time for work to begin on the game that would become Tomodachi Collection New Life, or as it's known in English, simply Tomodachi Life. At its core, Tomodachi Life is a beefed up version of Collection. The island is expanded, but looks similar. The user interface, icons and so on are practically unchanged. In fact, when project manager Shinya Takahashi, who is now in charge of all Nintendo software development, saw the team's prototype, he said, "There's not enough of a next generation feeling here." But where the game excelled was in its volume of things, hats, t-shirts, items, lines of dialogue and so on. To keep track of all their ideas, director Ryutaro Takahashi found a big book where the team could put their ideas and told them to write any possible idea they came up with into it. Food, clothes, jokes, and so on. Eventually, this idea book had 5,500 entries in it. They also added in the ability for Miis to marry and have babies, aided by the invention of so-called adult spray, which would instantly age a Mii up from child to adulthood. And so, on the 13th of April 2013, Tomodachi Life was released in Japan. It was an instant hit, selling 400,000 copies within its first week of release. But what about outside of Japan? Well, that's where things get interesting. The previous game, Tomodachi Collection, hadn't left Japan due to the technical challenges of adapting the computerized speaking voices into English. Longtime Nintendo of America localizer Bill Trinan explained, "They have these quirky voices and you can adjust the voice for any character you want. So the first step was actually getting that to work well in English. Japanese being a phonetic language, it works very easily. English, it took a lot of work." In fact, Trinan explained that it took several years of collaboration between Nintendo's American and Japanese teams to get the English voices up and running. But, surely enough, on the 6th of June 2014, Tomodachi Life was released in the US and Europe. Eventually, the game ended up selling 6.72 million copies worldwide, more than double that of the first game. There was only one blot on the game's release: the controversy around the game's lack of gay relationships. Tomodachi Life doesn't allow for any kind of same-sex romance options, despite the fact that same-sex marriage was legal in the UK and a number of US states at the time of the game's release. There was a major backlash to this omission when Tomodachi Life was released internationally, to which Nintendo stated, "We never intended to make any form of social commentary with the launch of Tomodachi Life. We hope that all of our fans will see that Tomodachi Life was intended to be a whimsical and quirky game, and that we were absolutely not trying to provide social commentary." Obviously, that's a terrible statement. Gay people aren't social commentary, they're just trying to exist. Staff from Nintendo of America called for a meeting with Nintendo of Japan, and over the course of an entire night, they explained how tone-deaf and offensive the company's statement had been. The next morning, Nintendo released a second, revised statement reading, "We apologize for disappointing many people by failing to include same-sex relationships in Tomodachi Life. We pledge that if we create a next installment in the Tomodachi series, we will strive to design a gameplay experience from the ground up that is more inclusive." Now, in 2016, Nintendo released 2 new Tomodachi games, each of them spin-offs from the main series. The first was Miitomo, the company's first ever mobile game. Miitomo was produced by Yoshio Sakamoto and directed by Ryutaro Takahashi, making the game a direct successor to Tomodachi Collection and Tomodachi Life. It was co-developed by established mobile developer DeNA, but Nintendo's internal team were the ones who worked on the graphics, gameplay, music, and so on. The game was a success initially, with over 10 million downloads only a month after release. But Miitomo was less of a game and more a communication tool. You could message your friends and hear what they had to say back. But as the months went on, fewer and fewer of those 10 million users checked in regularly. And in 2018, Nintendo pulled the plug on Miitomo. The other Tomodachi adjacent game that launched in 2016 was Miitopia, a quirky, offbeat Mii-based RPG. Of the 2 projects, Miitopia was the more successful, selling 1.2 million copies on 3DS and another 1.8 million when it was ported to the Nintendo Switch. However, Miitopia is not truly a Tomodachi Life game. It was developed by an entirely separate team within Nintendo, so while it certainly bears many similarities with Tomodachi Collection and Tomodachi Life, it's not a direct successor. But what Miitopia does contain is gay relationships, sort of. So the game has a mechanic called friendship, which measures how close a pair of Miis have become. But while the mechanic is called friendship, it's represented by big red love hearts with names like precious, devoted, joined at the hip, together forever, and even soulmates. So there's definitely a level of ambiguity here compared to Tomodachi Life, where Miis marry and have children. But this romance/friendship mechanic applies to any pair of Miis, regardless of gender. So you can have 2 male or 2 female Miis described as soulmates. In other words, I think Nintendo followed up on their promise from 2014. And all of that brings us to 2025, with the announcement of Tomodachi Life Living the Dream. A brand new Tomodachi game for the Switch feels like a miracle, and there's a lot up in the air here. Who are the developers? Are Yoshio Sakamoto or Ryutaro Takahashi involved at all? Even numbering the game is difficult. For Western fans, this is Tomodachi Life 2, but really it's the 3rd game in the series, unless you count Miitomo or Miitopia or both. At any rate, Tomodachi Life Living the Dream has big shoes to fill, and I, for one, am excited to see how it does. Thanks very much for watching, and a huge thanks to my patrons, including Alison Withernall, Brett and Eric, Candy Crystal, Cyprian Eov, Daryl Gero, Ellie Birnbaum, Eliza the Doe, Hi There and Bye, Jim Gilsonan, Kieran Chan, Kelly Wright, Lucas Little, Michael Gunter, Preston Kurth, Skate or Pie, Thomas Söderlund, and Tlazot Lalia.